morning. Thank you, Steve, for another great children's message. As you're with me, we're going to be looking at John, the 15th chapter, verses 12 through 17. This is part of our sermon series, The Easter Story, and we're going to be looking at doubt today. Getting through our work week can be difficult under the best of circumstances, and now that we're going online for school and work and church and shopping and play and just about everything else in our life hasn't made our week any easier. In fact, there are a lot of people who are trying to find ways to take a break from all of the screen time. You might even catch yourself daydreaming of getting someone else to sit in front of the screen for you so you can play hooky. If you don't know what playing hooky means, it's supposedly a transliteration of a Dutch term, you guessed it, called hooky, but they spell it Hookje, that was used to refer to the game that we would call hide and seek. Whenever a student skipped school and a truant officer found out about it, the game was afoot. Like those students, we might want to hide from our new online life, but since we can't actually go very far under the new quarantine laws, it'd be pretty easy to find us. I was reminded this week about an old cartoon that was poking fun at the use of technology in schools. It showed a classroom in which the teacher was absent. He had recorded his lecture, and it was playing from a tape deck on his desk. In the next block was a cartoon was all of the students' desks on which sat smaller tape decks recording away the lecture. Not a student in sight. But we found that it doesn't really work that way, right? There has to be some connection, some conversation, an exchange between us in some way, even if it is technology that is making that happen. But that doesn't keep us from daydreaming about playing hooky. Evidently, a programmer working for Verizon figured out how to do the unimaginable, how to play hooky while hiding in plain sight. He did this by outsourcing his own duties to a Chinese firm whom he paid 1/5 of his six-figure salary to do. He still showed up at work, but he spent his time cruising the internet instead of programming because, well, he didn't need to do that. I don't know the rest of the story, but I do know that his scheme was discovered. What I don't know is what happened to him. He might have been fired, but then again, he might have been promoted to a managerial position as well. Have you ever been told a story that seemed so outlandish that you just couldn't accept it, that it really happened? I felt that way about a story I was told when I was living in East Tennessee. We lived near a town called Irwin, where supposedly it happened back in 1916 that an elephant traveling with a circus managed to kill one of its handlers. The local officials determined that it was not an accident, but that the elephant had truly intended to kill the man. And as they would, they hung it for its crimes. Now, I thought that was a little far-fetched until I saw the newspaper article reporting it, including pictures of it. And, well, while it was true, it was still a little unimaginable. But believe me when I say that you just can't make that kind of stuff up. At least that's what Mark Twain said in 1897, just a few years before the elephant hanging. In that year, Mark released a travelogue titled Following the Equator, A Journey Around the World. And in the 15th chapter, he declared truth is stranger than fiction. But he concluded that it is so because fiction is obliged to stick to the possibilities, but truth isn't. In other words, those who try to convince people of a lie, something that isn't true, will always do their best to make the story sound convincing, to sound possible. They never throw in something unbelievable, as that would defeat their purpose. Most of Mark Twain's travelogue really was true, but he couldn't help himself. He ended up adding a few stories that were later proved to be, well, false. And because those were in there, it made people question whether any of it was true. But those few tall tales made for more interesting reading, and the truth was he needed to sell books because he was in debt, and this was his plan to get out of it. One of the stories he included was how Cecil Rhodes made his first fortune. He was a very successful businessman who, at his death, founded the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford University, which some of you may have heard of. As Twain told the story, Rhodes found a London newspaper that was only 10 days old in the belly of a shark that he caught in Sydney Harbor in Australia. He acted on the news that it announced that France had declared war on Germany by convincing a local businessman to corner the wool market before anyone else heard the news, which wouldn't happen until the next steamship arrived, and that would take another 30 days. Those armies were going to need uniforms, and they would make them out of wool. So they got busy buying up all the wool, and when the news finally broke, the wool prices immediately climbed, and well, they made a handsome profit. We would call that insider trading, but it didn't happen. It wasn't true. But there are still people on the internet today who are saying that it might be true. With all of the information we have access to these days, and with all of the ways we can communicate it to one another, some educators are saying that we don't need to teach students content. We just need to teach them how to determine what content is true and what is not, and how to use it. Otherwise, they are going to end up being the victims of phishing scams that come in the form of an email telling them that their account has been compromised and they need to provide their username and password to verify their account. To determine whether something is true or not, we need to ask questions. That truth is always going to be there for us. We just need to find out. And we do that by asking questions. That's true of our faith as well. Did Jesus really die on the cross? Was he a real person? How do we know that the gospel writers were describing what really happened? Questions like these may cause some to doubt what you've been told is true, but they should also inspire you to seek answers to those questions. And there are answers to all of the questions that can be raised about our faith. Long before Jesus' victory over the grave that we celebrated last week on Easter morning, Jesus spoke to his disciples about something truly unbelievable: his love. They had experienced it. His disciples were, of course, far from perfect. They were prideful at times, self-promoting at times, and they were even afraid to speak up about what they thought, like that time whenever Jesus asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" Well, keeping quiet wasn't Peter's problem. He was always speaking up, even when it would have been better for him to have kept his mouth shut. But on that occasion, he was right to speak up. He said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven." He didn't get the truth from man's wisdom or from some personal experience or even from something that he had witnessed. It was revealed to him by God from heaven. Now, that's not the kind of thing that you would include in a story if you simply were trying to devise something that people would believe. But the truth is stranger than fiction. Jesus had to confront his disciples when they were wrong, and he forgave them when they acknowledged it, which they did. He taught them, challenged them, and loved them like a shepherd loves his sheep. And since they lived with him, they got to know whether Jesus was the real deal or not. You can learn a lot about a person when you live with them. You might be able to fool those who only see you on a screen, but you can't fool those who live with you all the time. They were there when Jesus extended his love to others who, like themselves, did not deserve it. Like that time when he defended the woman who was caught in adultery, or when he had dinner at Zacchaeus' house. His love was shown to all sorts of outcasts and sinners. And the religious leaders of his day couldn't believe it. That's not the sort of thing they thought a Messiah should do, messing around and spending time with people like that. But it is exactly what the prophet said the Messiah would do. Unbelievable. Love is what breaks through our doubts. People wonder if God really exists, if He cares about them. Then sometimes someone shows up in God's name and loves on them. And they begin to think that maybe this God of the Bible has heard their prayers. He really is real. He's showing His love to them. Love has been defined as taking care of one another's needs, not because you have a special relationship with the other person, but because you are able to meet that need and you have this push within you from God to meet that need. Love is about what you do and not about what the person is who receives it. Jesus was always loving on people, not giving them only giving them what they sought, but also what they actually needed. Like the man with the withered hand, he wanted it healed, and Jesus forgave his sins. But to show that He could give what he needed, the forgiveness of sins, He did what you can see. He healed the man's hand, which showed that he was able to do the kinds of things that only God can do, which is forgiveness of sins. Which is more believable, or which is more unbelievable? Jesus stood up for the downtrodden, embraced the wayward. He healed those who came to Him, but He also taught them the truth. He did so because they were like sheep who had no shepherd. He wouldn't just talk to them about love, but He was compassionate, and He was charitable, and He was caring. And with every expression of love, the people began to believe that perhaps He really was the Messiah. The disciples had seen Jesus express His love in unbelievable ways, even showing it to His enemies, which is pretty unbelievable. But remembrances of His love was not what came rushing back to the minds of the disciples as they huddled in the room behind locked doors, as they thought of the cross and Jesus' death on it. They were definitely more afraid of what man could do them rather than what God could do to them. When Jesus first began telling them that He must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the elders and chief priests and scribes' hands, that He be killed and raised on the third day, it was Peter who spoke up again, taking Him aside and rebuking Jesus, saying, "God forbid it. Lord, this will never happen to you." And believe it or not, it was Thomas, doubting Thomas, who proclaimed, "Let us also go, that we may die with Him." He had the best of intentions, but they were swept aside in the shadow of the cross. When the news came that Jesus' grave was empty, their hearts had turned to stone. They refused to believe what they were told because they were entertaining false answers to the deep questions of their faith. Dead people just don't get back up. Well, most dead people. They had seen Lazarus come out of the grave, and they had seen the son of the widow in Nain, who was being carried out for burial, brought back to life by Jesus. And they had seen Jairus' daughter brought back to life. But Jesus was around to do those things, and now it was Jesus who was dead. Who was going to raise Him? This wasn't the first time that they doubted what Jesus had told them. Even while walking on the water, Peter took his eyes off of Jesus and looked at the waves. And by considering that what he was doing was impossible, he was overcome by his doubt and he began to sink. It was only then that Jesus told him, "Oh, you little faith." But at least he believed enough for a moment to take those first steps before he began to doubt. And that's got to count for something, right? One of the last things that Jesus taught His disciples was the result of His going over to a fig tree on their way into Jerusalem. It had only leaves and no fruit. And Jesus said to the tree, "No longer shall there ever be any fruit from you." And immediately the fig tree withered all at once, right before their eyes. The disciples were so amazed, they asked how this could possibly have happened. And Jesus told them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to this fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it will happen. What filled the disciples' thoughts as they huddled behind that locked door after Jesus' death were doubts. Despite 3 years of seeing the unbelievable take place, they could not understand why the women would tell them such an unbelievable story that the tomb was empty because Jesus had risen. If they had only said, as the guard were paid to do, that someone had stolen his body, that they could believe. But the truth is stranger than fiction. It is not that the disciples couldn't remember what Jesus had told them was going to happen. They knew good and well what Jesus had told them, for he told them more than once that after 3 days he was going to rise again. It's just that they couldn't, in that moment, believe that it really happened. There is a place for doubt. In fact, some educational psychologists have shown that without doubt, a person cannot grow in their faith. They can't make their faith their own. I had to look at a lot of these studies whenever I was writing a paper for a class at Texas Tech. It was a paper on the spiritual development of incoming freshmen. The dean of students who was teaching the class wanted to know why so many freshmen were showing up with strong faith and then ending up letting go of that faith so quickly. It ends up that when doubt is cast on one's faith by an authority figure, like the professor of a class, serious questions rise. But rather than challenging the students to discover solid answers that would lead them through their doubts into a stronger faith, one that was now their own and not just what they had been taught by others, but they were being told that what they once believed was simply unreasonable and unbelievable and only fit for the uneducated. They were being told that they needed to set it aside as they did their old cherished toys from childhood. It may have been important to them when they were young, but now that they were older and wiser and educated, they didn't need it anymore. They were being trapped in their doubts and not encouraged to find the answers that would lead them to the other side with a strong faith. As I said earlier, we need to ask those hard questions about our faith. Was the grave really empty? And if so, why was it empty? What really happened to Jesus' body? When we consider poor answers like, well, it's just a story, just a fairy tale, not a historical event, we might grow disillusioned for a while, but as we continue to seek and discover better answers, our faith will be strengthened. It is true that some people get stuck in their doubts rather than moving forward in their faith. But it is when our doubts are confronted by the truth that we really begin to grow. After all, Jesus said that those who seek will find. Find what? We'll find that the stories that are recorded in the scriptures are not fairy tales, but they are accurate historical accounts that can be substantiated time and again by archaeology. It just seems that this is a good historical document to learn from. The accounts reveal how God's love for the world resulted in the death, burial, and resurrection of his Son. On one occasion, when Jesus told his disciples that this was going to happen, in advance of it happening, he began to teach them with a different story, the one we read earlier today. He spoke about a vine and its branches, its fruit, and the vine dresser in the first part of the chapter 15. The vine's purpose, he said, is to bear fruit. It grows branches. Some of them bear fruit and others do not. The vine dresser cleans and prunes the vine, and he is celebrated for his care of the vine. Using this story, Jesus taught that his Father loves him, and he in turn loves his disciples. But I understand the first part. Jesus is worthy of God's love. It's that next part that is hard to believe because we are not deserving of Jesus' love. So this love that Jesus was talking about is not dependent on worthiness. Yet at the same time, it is this love that compels us to keep commands. Jesus kept his Father's command because he loved him. And we keep Christ's commands because we love him. And in doing so, we end up bearing the fruit. just as God's love compelled him to send his Son, and Jesus' love compelled him to lay down his life that he might take it up again, so our love compels us to care for those around us just as Jesus did. John said that Jesus' love elevated their relationship with his disciples to that of friendship. They were not slaves forced to do as were directed. As friends, Jesus brought them into his confidence, told them what was going to happen, and extended to them the freedom to choose whether they would keep following him or not. If the choice between being a fruitless branch destined for the fire or being a branch that bears fruit is put before us, well, which would you choose? Most of the disciples chose to bear fruit, to grow through their doubts, but one did not. Ever since Jesus' crucifixion, which is the only time when Nietzsche, a philosopher made famous by declaring that God is dead, was ever right, it was doubt that flooded these disciples' minds. How could they bear fruit if the vine was dead? They didn't remember the answer that Jesus had already given them. Jesus had told them, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. Paul would take up the same argument, teaching that the seed that you plant doesn't bring about life until it dies. One might argue that the seed doesn't actually die. It simply goes through a transformation. What was once the seed becomes the roots, and it produces the vine that bears the branches that produce the fruit. And that's exactly what happened to Jesus. He was dead. Yet Peter said that while he was in this state of death, he also went to a spiritual prison where he preached to the souls who died in the days of Noah. So there was, in some sense, life in this dead body that lay in the grave. A dead body that would be energized by God, transforming it and raising it to life, but a body that was prepared for eternity. He was not a ghost, but he could pass through locked doors. He could vanish from their sight after showing them his hands and his feet. And yet they could touch his bones and flesh. He could eat, yet at the same time his body was different. When pressed about the nature of Jesus' resurrected body, because those who believed their story that Jesus was victorious over the grave wanted to know how their own resurrected bodies might be like one day, they were told, we don't really know exactly what it's going to be like. But we know on that day when he returns again, we will see him and we are going to be just as he is. They were not put off by these questions, but they used them as an opportunity to affirm the truth. But what really demonstrates Jesus' being alive, that Jesus, the vine, is alive and well, is that his branches, his disciples, that we keep on bearing fruit. What kind of fruit? The kind that takes place whenever you express his love. You may recall that the resurrected Lord asked Peter, "Do you love me?" 3 times. And after each affirmation, Jesus told him to go and bear fruit by feeding his lambs, by loving on them. And the first thing that those who believed were baptized by Peter's message on the day of Pentecost did is that they began to take care of one another. They shared what they had in common with one another so that no one had need. They demonstrated love to one another, and by doing so, they were bearing fruit. Doubt will keep you from loving as he loved. It will trap you in your fears, and you will, spiritually speaking, die. And you will not bear fruit. But the truth that the vine is alive and well, and that we, the branches, are energized by his love and by his spirit and by his death, burial, and resurrection, you will see people who come to life as they share his love to those that are around them. And in doing so, they will produce fruit. It really is a family trait. For God so loved, and Jesus so loved, and so do we. I encourage you to find ways to love one another, to do so even though we are socially distant from one another, that you express the love that God has put in your heart, and by doing so you bear fruit. Would you join me in prayer? Lord, we come to you because we need to be your people. We need your truth in our lives. We need your spirit to fill us. And we want to bear the fruit of love in the lives of those around us. So help us to be creative. Lead us so that we might show and demonstrate that you are alive and well by giving love to those that we meet. Jesus, it is in your name that we pray.